And the quiet body method is a practical framework for cultivating stillness, awareness, refined attention and embodied presence. It's not simply a style of yoga or a collection of postures or techniques. It's a progressive method of practice that follows an intelligent arc or progression that emulates the life cycle. And it gently guides us from the noise and fragmentation of a modern life, a modern world that demands so much of us, towards a greater sense of clarity, of steadiness, of self-understanding. You know, and many of us spend our days moving from one demand, one role, one position, one responsibility or duty to the next, and during which time we're constantly overstimulated. You know, we're pulled from pillar to post, and our attention is therefore distracted and divided and fragmented, and our nervous systems become very overstimulated. And despite all of that sensory consumption, we take very little time to stop and digest. And so much of our experience becomes shaped by those distractions and those stimuli, as opposed to through authentic presence and awareness. And so we become very skilled at doing all of the things that we do in our daily life, yet somehow unfamiliar with simply just being. And so the quiet body method begins by sort of slowly unravelling what's been done there and reversing that direction. And rather than asking what we can achieve through yoga, it asks a very different question of us, and that is actually who we are when the noise begins to settle. You know, when the self unfolds, and with it all the layers and the images and the duties and the responsibilities and the ideas of the future and the memories of the past, and all of that weight that we carry that as a burden that shackles and encapsulates us and binds us. You know, it asks who we are beneath all of that when we free ourselves from that, you know. And although the method is expressed through kind of structured practices, its purpose extends far beyond the yoga mat, you know. The qualities that we cultivate in practice, they gradually begin to influence the way that we move through our everyday life. So it's not something that we just embrace on the mat, or, you know, in the yoga studio or in the ashram or wherever we are. We kind of reshape the way that we relate to ourselves through the internal world, but equally how we relate to the external world as well, you know. So it's to ourselves, to others, and the world around us. It's the quiet body method, just like the system from which it's emerging, the Śānta Yoga system, has its roots in you know, classical yoga tradition and classical yoga philosophy. And while the structure is obviously developed for modern practitioners, its foundations remain deeply rooted in that, you know. And that much is clear as we start to progress through the system, the Śānta Yoga system, and through the methodology, the pillars and the gates, which we'll discuss in just a moment. We can see quite clearly, actually, you know, the way that it is rooted and the way that it sits firmly on those foundations. So, and we think for thousands of years, yoga's described already, anyway, in a very subtle way to us, a gradual refinement of attention through practice and through sadhana and through meditation and focus and self-study and surrender to the divine and all of this. And despite that, the physical body has only ever provided an entry point, never a kind of destination, never a final, never a final destination or a final goal. It's through practice using the physical body and through pranayama, through breath work or breath exercise, depending on how you refer to it, but through cultivation of a steady breath, that we can steady a fluctuating mind, a fragmented and a disturbed mind, and we can move closer somehow towards steadiness and towards awareness and self-study, and ultimately towards a quieter relationship as well with, with that fluctuating mind, We've only got I remember the term yogas chitta vritti nirodha. Yeah, yogas chitta vritti nirodha. So the yoga brings about equilibrium or stillness to the fluctuations of the mind, And so the quiet body method sort of follows the same sort of spirit, actually. It doesn't seek to recreate ancient systems exactly as they once were, old traditions and old yogic philosophical systems, but instead translates probably rather timeless principles into a more clear, modernised, accessible framework for contemporary life, and contemporary living. It's not about performance, it's not about aesthetics, but rather, is about becoming more present and more authentic and a little more aware, even if it's bit by bit, steadily over time, a little more at home within ourselves as well. So, it's probably the purpose or the goal feels somewhat different and somewhat more relevant to modern life than perhaps the more traditional and older systems of yoga might. So the method follows a deliberate progression as well, because meaningful growth very rarely happens all at once or in a small instance. It takes time, and just in the same way that nature kind of unfolds through seasons, and that every life, especially every human life, moves through recognisable stages of development and growth, of beginning, growth, maturity, and completion. Our practice follows a similar kind of rhythm and a similar structure. And the quiet body method aims and seeks to embody and translate and communicate that through the practice. And so we begin by establishing foundations, and then from those foundations we develop a greater sensitivity, and that sensitivity gives rise to a transformation that occurs. And that transformation gradually softens, and what's left behind leads to surrender. Nothing's rushed, nothing's forced. Each stage kind of prepares us for the next kind of stage, the next part of the process, but organically, fluidly, without being forced. Obviously, at times there's effort, there's activation, and at times throughout each stage we're required to surrender as well. There's transformation and surrender as well, but throughout that kind of progression, that intelligent progression, we're prepared by one stage for the next ensuing stage, of the practice, and that allows us to understand. Or it allows understanding to emerge through experience rather than simply through information, through being told, through consumption of information, or this is that and this is that. The practice unfolds as we journey through it, as opposed to us embarking on that journey and upon that journey and performing the practice and being given information at the same time. Hopefully that makes sense. So this kind of developmental journey is expressed through 4 practices actually, and those are the 4 pillars of the quiet body method. And actually within each of those pillars we immerse ourselves and we explore each pillar or each practice through 5 gateways. So the 4 pillars or the 4 practices, they kind of describe the journey, or they are the journey itself that we embark upon. But the 5 gateways are how we travel along that journey at different times through different stages, you know. And so the 4 pillars, the 4 practices, the first of which is mula, which is the root, you know, and no better place to start than the root, right, at the foundations. And, you know, having a very obvious association with the earth as its element, it's quite symbolic and representative of life's, the beginning of life's journey. And this practice cultivates grounding and stability. It cultivates steadiness and embodied awareness, you know, and is the essence of arrival, you know, in the same way that when we're born, we literally arrive. You know, this practice entirely embodies that principle, that idea of arrival and of presence, you know. And we learn to establish healthy movement patterns and develop structural integrity through being rooted, and create a sustainable relationship with practice. And actually, when we spoke just a moment ago about developing a greater sensitivity through our practice, if we imagine the tree, when it's a sapling, it's young and it's very sensitive, it's tender, it's sensitive to adverse weather, you know, too strong a wind, too much rain, too much sunshine, or not enough of one or the other, and that sapling will die, you know. It's yet to take root and firmly establish its foundations. But once it's taken root and established its base and grown a strong, steady trunk, it's able to withstand much more adverse weather. And in time, once it matures, to embrace the weather and actually move with the wind and you know, benefit from the heavy rains and the harsh sunshine. And it will move through stages and seasons, or through stages with the seasons, transforming at the appropriate times through its life cycle, as it in the same way embraces a sense of, or a much deeper sense of true harmony with its environment and being, you know. And so in the same way, the practice teaches us to do that, and mula is the first of those 4 practices, you know. So everything that's built following mula is built upon the foundations that we set in mula, you know. And so specifically for that practice, rather than chasing complexity and performance and you know, as much as it's easy to be driven by our ego and to desire, you know, fast or explosive movements and being up on our feet and inversions and all of that business, we actually discover the value of simplicity, and we learn that stability comes first. That comes before mobility and awareness and achievement, and in a sense is much more about presence before performance, you know. And that leads us to the next stage, the next pillar, the next practice, which is practice 2, antarmukha, which antar means inwards or internal, and mukha we hear quite a lot, adho-mukha svanasana, urdhva-mukha svanasana, you know, to face or turn or to look, so looking inwards. And practice 2 is for us turning inwards, and once we've set the foundations of the first practice, you know, the direction of the practice begins to change because our focus turns inwards. Initially, it's very much about arrival and presence, but here, during the second practice, we turn our attention inwards and we literally begin to scan the body. And apologies, we have a guest, but we start to move through the layers of the body with a deeper attention and sense of focus, and associated probably quite relevantly with the element of water, and that fluid stage of growth from our root, from our foundation, the second practice, antarmukha, invites us to develop a greater sensitivity to breath, to sensation, the energetic body beneath, not just the physical body either at the surface, but much deeper, beneath the surface, and to establish a kind of subtle dialogue with the layers of our body and our being, between, body, mind, and the energetic body and all the rest of it. So the emphasis kind of shifts away from external appearances and performance and aesthetics and explosive practice and all of that, and even from the ground and establishing that steady root, which we've already done now. It shifts away, and our attention is turned towards internal experience and the sensation of that. What that is, what that feels like to really be present and to embody our sensations. It doesn't mean that we get lost or led astray by them, or that we necessarily become them, but that we are at one through quiet observation of them and with them. And it's essentially exactly that. We begin observing as opposed to reacting, and especially reacting to, the stimuli of the external world, as well as the internal world. We respond, which is something entirely different, but we don't react. So it's much more about listening than it is about, I suppose, having some sort of control over those stimuli or those influences, and in a sense cultivating a quieter, more stable relationship with ourselves. So that's what the turning inwards is. That's the second practice. Like water, awareness becomes more fluid, more adaptable and more receptive, and we become more receptive to the internal world, the inner world, as opposed to just the external world. And this brings about something quite extraordinary. It brings about the necessity for the third practice, which is Agni. Agni is the fire, or the fires of transformation. And with stability and sensitivity already established now, and with a developed and founded awareness and steadiness, practice naturally becomes transformative as we move towards a state of maturity, in a sense of the word. The fire of transformation represents this profound stage of established growth. And here we kind of explore discipline, tapas, also the fires, tapas, tejas, Agni, all implied there within the third practice of transformation. It's where there's conscious effort and the intelligent application of energy. We notice, and we're very aware, we've become very aware of the movement of energy throughout the body, throughout the vayu. And the challenge is no longer something for us to overcome or circumnavigate, depending on, it's something we talk a lot about in practice, being presented with obstacles in our practice, not necessarily physiologically, in terms of the physical body, but maybe there might be emotional or psychological, psycho-emotional obstacles that we're faced with that we might seek to overcome, or sometimes we might feel that we're unable to overcome and we need to circumnavigate, or that we need to let go of and surrender to as well. That's also very important. And so, those challenges become something that we no longer need to overcome or circumnavigate, because there's a sense of kind of intuitive and almost instinctive, in a sense that it becomes natural to us to embrace whatever those challenges entail, and they all bring about through the process of Agni a transformation, and that becomes something that refines us, every layer of us in our being, and so through consistent practice and through discipline and through commitment and dedication to our practice, we begin to recognise that transformation is not something that's kind of created or cultivated through force, through effort. Because effort's conflict. Effort is a moving away from what is. You know, it's more of something, or becoming something, at the expense of what was or what had become. You know, it's not to say that we want to become better because we're avoiding something necessarily, or we're in some dire state of conflict. But I think we can see logically, obviously, that, you know, it is always this or that, and this or that implies a conflict is happening, right? And so, you know, that the force and the effort to transform, to become or achieve more, we begin to let go of, because it happens naturally through the third practice. And so the fire of this practice is a form of illumination, and it enlightens us as to, and don't get lost with that word, but as to what is essential, and it gradually burns away through repetition and through tapas, through discipline, you know, everything that's unnecessary, you know, and during and with time, we ultimately and inevitably reinforce the other practices. We become stronger and more stable continuously, you know, not just physiologically, on a deeper level as well. And Agni naturally, just like the life cycle does, the third practice naturally brings us to the fourth and final pillar, the fourth and final practice, which is Laya. And Laya is dissolution. It's a letting go, a surrender that happens. And it's associated with the spaciousness of the sky or the ether, and a completion, a sense of completion, an ending. And not necessarily an ending in a negative or a detrimental way, but think of it as an invitation to soften unnecessary effort, which sometimes can be resistance as well, right? And for us to cultivate a sense of trust in ourselves, in something innate, in something constant that lies beneath the surface, in something that we tap into when in Shavasana, for example, at the end of a practice. And this is not always necessarily at the end of a practice, which you'll see actually within the pillars, because it's not there. But when, particularly as an example in Shavasana, when we start to observe the body and the way that it behaves in stillness, if we observe quietly enough, without the conditioning of and the context and the lenses through which we normally observe the body, and that we're tempted to observe the body, you know, with the ego in mind, and with the ideas of you know, what is or isn't, and more or less, and all of that business, all of that nonsense. If we just watch the body in stillness, the tie between the physical body and our awareness starts to soften. It's almost like we feel, even though we know we're able to move the body, we feel a sense of kind of paralysis, maybe, where we're becoming less contained by it, you know. And in that way, Laya, the practice, the fourth practice, helps us to cultivate that sense of spaciousness and that sense of dissolution, and it helps us to soften the tie, the tether between this refined awareness and the layers of the body, you know, all of them, the koshas, the sheaths, and to build this established sense of trust in something greater, right? And which ties in really well with one of the gateways, pranitan, which we'll talk about in a moment, surrender, where we surrender to, and we trust, you know, that there is this something beneath, this greater thing, you know, that ties us all, that connects it all. You know, so this stage, this fourth pillar, this final practice, explores restoration and silence, and a deep sense of presence, you know, of being in the present moment, as opposed to our minds distracting us and pulling us into the past or into the future. And actually, arguably, all thought processes are historic, because for the moment that they've happened, this is in the past, right? Obviously. So, you know, it's outside of that. And we can discover through this practice, through Laya, that stillness isn't something that we create or something that we cultivate, but it's something that has always, and I say this a lot, but it has always existed beneath the surface, beneath the constant movement of thought and activity and all of the stimuli of the external and the internal worlds, you know. And so the journey at the end comes full circle, and it's not really an end, it's cyclical, because we return to simplicity and we let go. We surrender. We let go of the body and all of the other stuff, all of the above, you know. And so naturally we begin again with the first practice, and it goes on. So that's the 4 practices. Now, of course, they're not fixed. It's not, oh, you have to do it this way, you have to do it that way. They are set series, but the series actually inevitably, and that's why the Śānta Yoga system is open-ended, it remains unfinished, because it aspires to develop with the modern world and with modern thinking and understanding, and with modern practice as well. And so too does the quiet body. You know, this method is open, and inevitably, actually, through one's progression, the practitioner's progression, as we refine our attention and as we observe more authentically and more organically as well, not just during our practice, but through, you know, through daily life. The practice is life, it's living, it's being, it's embodied within the practice, and vice versa. And so the practice of asana, of pranayama, all of that becomes something that's becomes much more intuitive and much more natural, and something that happens almost autonomously, as opposed to adhering to rigorous, you know, a rigorous set of, you know, postural positions or pranayama or whatever. I mean, that remains, of course, but as a basis from which we can continue our practice, but it's open, you know. So that's it. That's the 4 pillars of the four gateways, the 4 practices. We have an ice cream van approaching. We then have the 5 gateways, and these aren't something that exists separate from the 4 practices. Each actually of the 4 practices are explored through the same 5 gateways, and they provide a consistent kind of rhythm throughout the entire method, the entire quiet body method. And although the practices will naturally evolve, like we've just spoken about, the gateways will remain familiar at all times, allowing us to revisit the same principles from kind of deeper levels of understanding. And the first of the gateways is pravesha, which is arrival. And every meaningful practice begins with arrival. We have to be present, we have to be there. If we try to practice, we try to observe a practice and we're not present, we're not there. You know, our minds are elsewhere, or our bodies, you know, we're not truly arrived on the mat. We're still, you know, being pulled from pillar to post. We can't practice honestly. We can't practice authentically. We can't commit and dedicate ourselves to the present moment, which is a requirement. You know, we have to cultivate the state of body and mind across all its layers, across all its dimensions, to truly embody the practice, right? So these gateways provide a consistent rhythm and a framework through which we experience the entire method. And as the practices evolve, the gateways remain, and that allows us to revisit the same principles, you know, from deeper levels of understanding later on. So Pravesh invites us to cross the threshold from the outer world into direct experience. So we become, you know, we withdraw from all of the stimuli, we withdraw from the unnecessary chaos, or maybe it's necessary, that much is open for discussion, you know, on another day. But we become aware of those distractions and of that fragmentation and we learn to establish intention and create the conditions for genuine presence, like I said a moment ago. And before we go anywhere, we obviously have to arrive. We have to be present. So that is the first gateway. And exactly how we do that, we'll go into much more detail about in the Quiet Body program and in the Śānta Yoga system wider system later on. The second gate is antar, which is the inner space. And obviously, having arrived at the first gate, our attention must begin naturally turning inwards, right? Inevitably, but not forcibly. And antar develops our capacity to observe breath and observe sensation, observe, not just sensation in the sense of, how it feels to do something or how it feels to be in a position, but energetically sensation, emotionally sensation, of course, physiologically sensation. But it's not limited there. It's the entire subtle landscape of our inner experience of the world around us externally and the inner world, and how we cultivate interoception and our sensory awareness and the foundations of inner listening and our kind of, I think the term is, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you will, someone will, propriospatial awareness as well. So all of that kind of tied in together, it is obviously the beginning of refining a deeper sense of awareness, and our body becomes much less something that we control and that contains us, and instead an instrument through which we might achieve a great learning, right? And that sets the foundation for the third gateway, which is transformation. Inevitably, once we are present and once we observe and once we are at one with all of the sensations of our multi-dimensional being, a profound transformation naturally occurs, and it's the third gateway. And that arises through conscious participation, right? But in a deep sense, And through the third gateway, we explore discipline, steady effort, the willingness to meet challenge with awareness and with presence, not with force. And that's very important. It's a very important point. There are many practitioners out there that are driven by conflict or driven by the ego and that meet challenge in such a way, or meet challenges and the challenges of their practice in such a way, through those lenses, and are therefore never really present when they do so, because they're hindered and shackled by conflict. And so rather than seeking intensity for its own sake or for something performative or aesthetic, we learn to refine ourselves through, and don't confuse this with education, but intelligent and consistent practice. So intelligence implying a still, unhindered, very consciously present mind, and so growth becomes a process of awakening and presence rather than something that we achieve through some form of performance or effort, right? And that in itself is a profound transformation when that happens. And the fourth gate is in a very similar way to, and echoed by the structure of the four practices or the four pillars of the quiet body, is pranidhana, which is surrender. And in some ways echoes more traditional yogic philosophy as well, because we know Ishvara pranidhana is one of the limbs, which is surrender to the divine, and not to be, not to run away with the word divinity here. We're not talking about religion. But there comes a point in each of the four pillars, in each of the four practices of the quiet body, where more effort is no longer, actually effort never was, but where, continued challenge and discipline and activation the harness and movement of energy and transformation, naturally comes to a point of stagnation, or no, stagnation is the wrong word, of stillness. And at the end of transformation, all that remains left is to surrender. And this much is obvious. And so Pranitana teaches us as the fourth gate to soften unnecessary striving, and again to cultivate or recultivate a sense of trust, accepting the world within and without, externally, and kind of embracing a state of non-attachment as well, across the board. So it reminds us that wisdom often emerges not through kind of holding on tighter, but through learning actually when to let go of things, And not to be confused with giving up. Surrender's not giving up. When we say letting go, we don't mean we're giving up on something, but rather it's a deep presence and a deep sense of acceptance, in that we allow life to unfold without necessary friction or resistance, right? It's that kind of pranitana. And that gateway presents itself through each of the four practices, and it's something that we learn as we move through the gateways to embrace. And of course, naturally, once we let go, we experience the fifth and final gateway, which is Mauna, the silence, the steady, constant silence, the stillness. And it doesn't necessarily mean the cessation of noise. That sometimes might be the case also, but it's a quiet awareness that's unfragmented and unhindered and undisturbed or perturbed by, an unsteady fluctuating mind, or an ever-demanding body that's, resisting or in a state of resistance, for example. So it's that steady, constant state that remains beneath thought, beneath emotion, beneath kind of continuous mental activity. And it's there where observation becomes effortless. It becomes a deeper sense of presence naturally. It happens by itself. It reveals itself. It unfolds, actually. And it's there that practice kind of gently dissolves into direct experience, as opposed to something that that requires effort, if that makes sense. And so it's kind of it's the destination that arrives, and the place from which every practice begins again, all at once. So we're full circle, again, So that's the fifth gateway, and the four practices, which make up the quiet body method, which makes up the backbone of the Śānta Yoga system as it aspires to emerge within this modern world and modern setting, right? These crazy times we're living in. And actually, although the quiet body method is experienced through structured practices, it's important to remember that it was never, and is obviously, this occurs, never intended to remain confined just to the yoga mat. Its real purpose is revealed in ordinary everyday life. It can influence the way that we listen before speaking. It can influence the way that we respond, to any given stimuli, instead of just kind of automatically reacting sometimes like we do. It can change the way and influence the way that we move through uncertainty with a sort of steadiness and conviction rather than fear, and in time, through experience, over many years of practice, as this has revealed itself over time, over the years, over the hours and the days and the months, the body starts to become quieter, unless it screams at you when there's an injury. it makes lots of noise then, but the body generally becomes quieter and the mind much less demanding, you know, and a state of deep awareness is something that becomes much more continuous. You know, I mean, it's not to say that it always is continuous and it always remains there. We are human beings after all, and the human state of being is that we will always experience conflict and we will always experience this fragmentation of the mind. That much is very obvious, you know, it's natural for us to do that. But here we have a method for us to work with it, you know, as opposed to against it, and for us to be very present as opposed to, you know, as opposed to a passenger in life. You know, we get to live it. So, you know, the practice and the quiet body method, it stops being something that we do, you know, in yoga generally. You know, something that we do for an hour or a couple of hours here or there each week. You know, the whole method and the whole system becomes a way of meeting life itself, you know. And that in itself is an invitation. It's a deep invitation, you know, to sort of slow down, really. To really be truly present, to look at those leaves, the way that they're moving in the wind over there, and to feel the gentle breeze on my shoulders, especially my sore one, you know, and sort of feel it in my hair and passing by my ears, even though the hair's not moving, what's left of it anyway, you know, just to be very present. The bird, the sun on my left foot, like, it's such a wondrous thing to experience, you know, and it's that kind of slowing down, and to pay attention, because we kind of block all of that out, don't we, and the mind just scatters left to right, right to left, forwards, backwards, you know. So, you know, the method helps us to become curious again, you know, curious like we were when we were children, you know, and to rediscover that sort of quiet intelligence that's always existed beneath the noise of our modern lives. You know, it's a way for us to remember who we are when all of that starts to fall away, when we shed all of that, you know, all of these images and ideas of who we are or who we're supposed to be or who we were or who we want to become, you know. And whether you're completely new to yoga or whether you're very experienced and you've been practicing for many years, you know, the journey with the quiet body, it always begins in the same place. You know, we arrive, we become present, and then from that single moment of arrival, everything else unfolds.